The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Denver Family Court as Emma Rodriguez clutched the thick golden fur of her therapy dog's neck. Justice, an 85-pound golden retriever with soulful brown eyes, stood perfectly still beside the 8-year-old girl, his professional therapy vest bearing the words "Do Not Pet Working Dog" in bold letters. Emma's small fingers trembled as she watched the growing crowd of reporters and camera crews, gathering like vultures outside the courthouse entrance. "Channel 7 News is here," whispered Maria Santos, Emma's court-appointed social worker, as she knelt beside the child. "And Channel 4, Fox, and I think I see CNN setting up over there." Maria had been Emma's advocate for 6 months now, ever since that horrific night when Denver police found the little girl locked in a bedroom closet, dehydrated and traumatized beyond imagination. The case had exploded across national headlines. Parents locked daughter in closet for 3 days, and the silent child, a Denver tragedy. Emma hadn't spoken a single word since that night. Not to police officers, not to doctors, not to therapists, and not to the parade of potential adoptive families who came to visit her at the children's home. The only living being who seemed to reach her was Justice, a specially trained therapy dog from the Colorado Canine Therapy Foundation. Dr. Rebecca Peterson, the child psychologist overseeing Emma's case, had made the unprecedented recommendation that justice be permitted in today's custody hearing. "Emma," Maria said softly, adjusting the collar of the child's bright yellow sundress, "remember what Dr. Peterson taught you about justice. He's here to help you feel safe, okay?" Emma nodded almost imperceptibly, her dark eyes never leaving the growing media circus. A reporter with perfectly styled hair was speaking animatedly into a camera, gesturing toward the courthouse behind her. "This is Emma Rodriguez's last chance to have her voice heard," the reporter was saying, though her voice was muffled by the courthouse's thick glass doors. "The 8-year-old hasn't spoken since the night police found her locked in a closet by her own parents. Today, Judge Margaret Harrison will decide Emma's fate in what's being called the most controversial custody case of the decade." Inside the courthouse, the normally quiet hallways buzzed with an energy that made Maria's stomach churn. Other social workers, lawyers, and court officials kept stealing glances at Emma and Justice as they made their way to the family court waiting area. Most had never seen a therapy dog in the courthouse, let alone one preparing to enter a custody hearing. The legal precedent Maria had fought to establish could either revolutionize how traumatized children were treated in the court system or end both their careers in spectacular fashion. "Is that really necessary?" asked David Chun, the assistant district attorney prosecuting Emma's parents for child endangerment. He gestured toward Justice, who was lying calmly at Emma's feet, his chin resting on his paws. "A dog in Judge Harrison's courtroom? Margaret's going to have both our heads for this circus." Maria's jaw tightened. She'd spent weeks researching legal precedents, consulting with child psychologists, and preparing legal briefs to make this moment possible. "That dog isn't a circus act, David. He's the only reason Emma sleeps through the night without screaming. He's the only reason she eats meals without having panic attacks. And he might be the only way she finds her voice today." The waiting area, filled with the key players in Emma's future. Rachel Rodriguez, Emma's biological mother, sat hunched in the corner with her court-appointed attorney, occasionally glancing toward her daughter with desperate, pleading eyes. Rachel's husband, Miguel, faced separate charges and wouldn't be present, but his absence hung heavy in the air. Near the windows, 3 different families sat in their own clusters: the Hendersons, the Washingtons, and the Patels, each believing they were the right choice to adopt Emma and give her the loving home she deserved. Tom and Sarah Henderson, both teachers in their early 40s, had been Emma's foster parents for the past 3 months. They'd watched her slowly begin to trust again, though she still communicated primarily through written notes and gestures. Sarah Henderson's eyes were red-rimmed from a sleepless night, knowing that today's hearing would determine whether Emma could stay with them permanently or be placed elsewhere. Dr. Peterson emerged from Judge Harrison's chambers, looking both exhausted and determined. She'd spent the previous hour explaining to the judge why Justice's presence was crucial for Emma's testimony. "The child has severe post-traumatic stress disorder," she'd explained. "Traditional therapy methods haven't been effective. This dog represents safety and stability to her. Without justice, I don't believe Emma will be able to communicate her wishes to the court." As the clock approached 10 a.m., the time scheduled for the hearing, Maria felt Emma's hand slip into hers. The little girl's palm was cold and clammy, her breathing shallow. Justice immediately lifted his head, sensing the change in his young companion's emotional state. The dog had been trained to recognize the early signs of panic attacks and had successfully intervened dozens of times over the past months. "Emma," Maria whispered, "you remember what we practiced, right? If you need Justice's help, just give him the signal, and he'll know what to do." Emma nodded, her free hand moving instinctively to rest on Justice's broad back. The warmth of his fur and the steady rhythm of his breathing seemed to calm her slightly. The courtroom doors opened with a creak that echoed through the hallway. Bailiff Thompson, a kind-faced man who'd worked family court for 15 years, appeared in the doorway. "Rodriguez custody hearing," he announced formally. "Judge Harrison is ready." As they prepared to enter the courtroom that would determine Emma's entire future, Maria offered a silent prayer that the controversial decision to bring justice would prove to be the right one. The little girl who hadn't spoken in 6 months was about to face the most important conversation of her young life, with only a golden retriever and a determined social worker standing between her and a system that had already failed her once. The next hour would change everything. Judge Margaret Harrison sat alone in her chambers at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before the Rodriguez custody hearing was scheduled to begin. The case file spread across her mahogany desk told a story that had haunted her sleepless nights for weeks. Crime scene photos showed a bedroom closet barely large enough for a child to sit, with scratches on the inside of the door where small fingernails had clawed desperately for freedom. Medical reports documented severe dehydration, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that made seasoned emergency room doctors weep. At 58, Margaret Harrison had presided over Denver family court for nearly 2 decades. She'd seen every kind of child abuse, neglect, and family tragedy imaginable. But Emma Rodriguez's case was different. The silent 8-year-old had become the face of a national conversation about child welfare, media coverage of court proceedings, and now, most controversially, the role of therapy animals in the justice system. Her phone had been ringing since 5 a.m. First, it was Judge William Crawford from the Colorado Supreme Court, her mentor and longtime friend. "Margaret, are you absolutely sure about allowing that dog in your courtroom? The media is calling it everything from revolutionary to ridiculous. One wrong move and this becomes a circus that undermines the dignity of family court." Then came the call from District Attorney Patricia Wells. "Harrison, I've got 3 news stations asking me if Denver Family Court has lost its mind. A therapy dog? In a custody hearing? What's next? Comfort llamas for divorce proceedings?" Wells had laughed, but Margaret could hear the underlying concern. High-profile cases could make or break careers, and everyone knew it. The most difficult call came from her own daughter Sarah, now a family lawyer in Seattle. "Mom, I saw the story on CNN. Are you really going to let a dog influence a child's testimony? Dad would have been proud of you for taking risks, but this seems..." Sarah's voice had trailed off, leaving the concern unspoken but understood. Margaret's late husband, Robert, had been a child psychologist before his death from cancer 5 years earlier. During their 30-year marriage, he'd often talked about the limitations of traditional courtroom settings for traumatized children. The adversarial nature of courts re-traumatizes kids who've already been through hell, he'd said countless times. We need to find better ways to hear their voices. If Robert were alive, Margaret knew he'd support her decision, but his absence made the weight of responsibility feel crushing. Dr. Rebecca Peterson's psychological evaluation lay open on Margaret's desk, marked with yellow highlighter in dozens of places. The report painted a devastating picture of Emma's condition: severe post-traumatic stress disorder, selective mutism, hypervigilance, and dissociation episodes. But it also contained hope. The introduction of therapy dog Justice has resulted in the first measurable improvement in Emma's condition since the trauma occurred. The child demonstrates decreased anxiety, improved sleep patterns, and increased willingness to engage in therapeutic activities when the dog is present. The legal precedents were thin but encouraging. A courthouse in Oregon had allowed a therapy dog during a sexual assault victim's testimony. Texas had recently passed legislation permitting emotional support animals in certain family court proceedings. But Denver would be among the first major metropolitan courts to allow a therapy dog in a custody hearing, and Margaret knew the legal community was watching. At 7:15 a.m., her clerk, Janet Morrison, knocked softly on the chamber door. "Your Honor, Channel 7 is requesting an interview about the therapy dog decision. And Judge Patterson from Circuit Court wants to know if you've lost your mind." Janet had worked with Margaret for 12 years and had never seen her take on such a controversial case. Also, there's a reporter from the Washington Post on line 2, and someone from 60 Minutes left 3 messages. Margaret waved away the requests. The last thing she needed was to turn Emma's hearing into a media spectacle. But she knew that outcome was probably inevitable, regardless of her cooperation with reporters. The case had already been featured on national news programs, with legal experts debating whether therapy animals in courtrooms represented progress or dangerous precedent. Her computer chimed with an urgent email from Dr. Amanda Foster, director of the Colorado Canine Therapy Foundation. Justice has undergone extensive training for courtroom environments. He's been tested for reactions to loud noises, crowded spaces, and high-stress situations. His handler credentials are attached, along with insurance documentation and medical records. This dog has helped over 50 traumatized children find their voices. Emma Rodriguez needs him more than any child we've ever worked with. Margaret printed the email and added it to Emma's file, now over 3 inches thick. The competing interests were staggering. Emma's biological mother fighting to regain custody while facing criminal charges. 3 different potential adoptive families, each convinced they were Emma's best option. Child welfare advocates demanding Emma's voice be heard. Media outlets sensationalizing every development. And legal scholars debating the implications for judicial procedure nationwide. At 8:30 a.m., Margaret made her final review of Colorado statutes regarding courtroom accommodations for vulnerable witnesses. The law was clear that judges had discretionary authority to modify proceedings to ensure fair testimony from traumatized children. What wasn't clear was whether fair testimony could include a golden retriever. Her bailiff, Carl Thompson, appeared in the doorway with coffee and concern etched on his weathered face. "Judge, there are 47 reporters outside, 6 news trucks, and someone from the American Civil Liberties Union wanting to file an amicus brief. The courthouse administrator is having a nervous breakdown, and security is worried about crowd control." Margaret closed Emma's file and straightened her black robe. In 30 minutes, she would make a decision that could revolutionize how traumatized children were treated in American courtrooms, or destroy her reputation as a serious jurist. Either way, an 8-year-old girl who hadn't spoken in 6 months was depending on her to do the right thing. "Carl," she said quietly, "bring Emma Rodriguez and her dog into my courtroom. It's time to make history." The Denver family courtroom had never seen anything like it. By 9:45 a.m., every seat was occupied, with additional observers standing along the walls under the watchful eyes of extra security guards, hastily called in for crowd control. The air thronged with nervous energy as reporters clutched notebooks, lawyers adjusted their ties for the cameras they knew were lurking outside, and spectators whispered among themselves about the unprecedented nature of what they were about to witness. In the front row, Rachel Rodriguez sat rigidly beside her court-appointed attorney, Marcus Weber. Rachel's hands shook as she twisted a tissue into shreds, her eyes darting constantly toward the courtroom doors, where her daughter would soon appear. She'd spent the previous night in her cramped apartment, staring at Emma's empty bedroom and rehearsing the words she hoped would convince her daughter to come home. The yellow walls still bore crayon drawings Emma had made 2 years ago, stick figures of a happy family that now seemed like artifacts from another lifetime. "Remember what we discussed," Weber whispered to his client. "You express remorse. You acknowledge your mistakes, but you emphasize that you've completed court-mandated therapy and you're ready to be the mother Emma needs." Weber was a seasoned public defender who'd handled hundreds of family cases, but none with this level of media attention. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on his every movement, knowing that legal analysts across the country would dissect his performance later on television. Across the aisle, the 3 competing adoptive families sat in separate clusters, each group representing a different vision for Emma's future. Tom and Sarah Henderson, both high school teachers from suburban Denver, held hands tightly as they reviewed their financial statements and home study reports one final time. They'd rearranged their entire lives over the past 3 months to accommodate Emma's needs, converting their spare bedroom into a safe space filled with books, art supplies, and a special bed for Justice when he visited. "I keep thinking about last Tuesday," Sarah whispered to her husband, referring to the breakthrough moment when Emma had finally smiled during a family dinner. She was telling Justice about her day at school, and for just a moment, she seemed like any other 8-year-old. Tom squeezed his wife's hand, both of them terrified that today's hearing might end their dream of officially adopting the little girl, who'd already become their daughter in every way that mattered. 20 feet away, Dr. James and Patricia Washington represented a different approach entirely. The prominent African-American physicians had already adopted 2 children from foster care and believed their experience with traumatized youth made them ideal candidates. Dr. James Washington had taken a leave of absence from his neurosurgery practice to focus on Emma's potential integration into their family, while Dr. Patricia Washington had consulted with child psychologists nationwide about the most effective treatment approaches for selective mutism. The third family, Raj and Priya Patel, sat quietly reviewing translated documents with their interpreter. The successful software entrepreneurs had immigrated from India 15 years earlier and saw in Emma's story echoes of their own childhood struggles with displacement and trauma. Their adoption application emphasized their multi-generational household where Emma would be surrounded by loving grandparents, aunts, and cousins who understood the healing power of extended family support. Behind the family section, a constellation of child welfare advocates, legal observers, and media representatives filled every remaining seat. Dr. Amanda Foster from the Colorado Canine Therapy Foundation sat with a thick binder of research studies, documenting the effectiveness of therapy animals in trauma recovery. Beside her, Professor Elena Martinez from Denver University's law school furiously scribbled notes for the law review article she planned to write about this groundbreaking case. The media presence was unprecedented for a family court proceeding. Although cameras weren't permitted inside the courtroom, sketch artists worked rapidly to capture the scene. while reporters live-streamed every development to audiences hungry for updates on the Silent Child case. Outside, television crews broadcast live updates every hour, with legal experts debating the implications of allowing therapy animals in judicial proceedings. Maria Santos checked her watch nervously as she prepared to escort Emma and Justice into this charged atmosphere. She'd attended hundreds of custody hearings during her 15-year career as a social worker, but none where a child's future felt so intertwined with broader questions about justice, healing, and the evolution of the legal system itself. Phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues across the country who were following the case, many asking for updates they could share with their own traumatized clients. At exactly 9:58 a.m., Bailiff Thompson appeared at the side door, his usually calm demeanor betraying hints of the tension everyone felt. "The judge is ready," he announced to Maria, who took a deep breath and opened the door to the waiting area, where Emma and Justice had been preparing for this moment. Emma appeared in the doorway, wearing her yellow sundress, her small hand resting on Justice's golden head as they walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom. The massive golden retriever moved with professional precision, his therapy vest identifying him as a working animal, his calm presence a stark contrast to the electric atmosphere surrounding them. A hush fell over the packed courtroom as every eye focused on the little girl and her canine companion. Rachel Rodriguez half rose from her seat, a desperate Emma escaping her lips before Weber pulled her back down. The adoptive families watched with bated breath as Emma passed their section, each hoping for some sign of recognition or preference. Judge Harrison's gavel echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. The case of Rodriguez versus the state of Colorado regarding the custody of Emma Rodriguez is now in session. This court recognizes that today's proceedings involve unusual circumstances that require special accommodations for the minor child's testimony. As Emma took her designated seat near the witness stand, Justice lying calmly at her feet, everyone in the courtroom understood they were witnessing either a revolution in how the justice system treated vulnerable children, or a spectacular departure from judicial norms that would be debated for decades. The circus had officially begun. The silence in Judge Harrison's courtroom was deafening as Emma Rodriguez stood frozen beside the witness chair, her small frame dwarfed by the formal judicial setting that surrounded her. Justice lay at her feet, his golden fur catching the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows, his intelligent brown eyes focused intently on his young companion's face. Every person in the packed courtroom held their breath, understanding that this moment would determine not just Emma's future, but potentially change how traumatized children were treated in courts across America. "Emma," Judge Harrison repeated, gently, her voice carrying the warmth of a grandmother despite the formal setting. "I know this is scary, sweetheart, but I need you to help me understand what you want. Where would you like to live? Who would you like to be your family?" The judge had removed her reading glasses and leaned forward slightly, trying to minimize the intimidating nature of her elevated bench. Emma's dark eyes remained fixed on the polished marble floor beneath her feet. Her breathing began to quicken, short, shallow gasps that Maria Santos recognized immediately as the beginning of a panic attack. The little girl's hands, which had been resting calmly on Justice's back, now gripped his fur so tightly that her knuckles turned white. A single tear rolled down her cheek and splashed onto the dog's golden coat. In the gallery, Rachel Rodriguez clutched her attorney's arm desperately. "She's my baby," she whispered, loud enough for several nearby reporters to hear and scribble frantically in their notebooks. "Emma, please, Mommy's here. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Marcus Weber placed a restraining hand on his client's shoulder, knowing that any outburst could damage their already slim chances of reunification. Tom Henderson felt Sarah's fingernails dig into his palm as they watched Emma struggle. Over the past 3 months, They'd witnessed Emma's gradual progress, small moments of laughter, tentative conversations, and slowly growing trust. But now, in this sterile courtroom environment filled with strangers and overwhelming pressure, all that progress seemed to evaporate. Sarah Henderson's eyes filled with tears as she watched the little girl they'd come to love retreat back into her shell of silence. Dr. James Washington leaned forward in his seat, his medical training automatically cataloging Emma's symptoms. Rapid breathing, trembling hands, dilated pupils, and the glassy-eyed stare that indicated dissociation. He'd seen similar responses in his pediatric patients facing traumatic medical procedures. His wife Patricia gripped his hand, both of them, knowing that Emma's inability to speak might destroy her chances of remaining with the family she'd grown to trust. The Patels exchanged worried glances, their interpreter quietly explaining Emma's distress to Raji's elderly mother, who had insisted on attending despite her limited English. The grandmother's weathered face creased with concern as she watched the child suffer, her own memories of displacement and trauma from decades earlier making Emma's pain feel achingly familiar. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Court reporter Linda Matthews stopped typing, her fingers hovering uselessly over the stenotype machine as no words were spoken. The sketch artists in the media section continued drawing, capturing the agonizing tableau of a little girl lost in her own terror, while dozens of adults waited helplessly for her to speak. Judge Harrison glanced at the clock on the courtroom wall. 10:47 a.m. They'd been waiting for 12 minutes, though it felt like hours. She'd handled thousands of custody cases during her career, but had never encountered a situation quite like this. The legal precedent was clear. Children, Emma's age, had the right to express their preferences regarding custody arrangements. But what happened when trauma stole a child's voice entirely? Dr. Rebecca Peterson, seated in the professional observer section, watched Emma's deteriorating condition with growing alarm. The child psychologist recognized all the warning signs of a severe dissociative episode, the kind that could take hours or even days to resolve. She'd warned everyone that the courtroom environment might be too overwhelming for Emma, but had hoped that Justice's presence would provide enough emotional support to help the child communicate. Maria Santos felt her heart breaking as she watched her client retreat deeper into silence. She'd fought so hard to bring justice into the courtroom, believing that the therapy dog's presence would give Emma the strength to speak. But now, as the minutes dragged on, she began to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. The media attention, the crowded courtroom, the formal legal setting, maybe it was all too much for a traumatized 8-year-old to handle. Justice himself seemed to sense the growing desperation in the room. The specially trained golden retriever lifted his massive head and looked directly at Emma's face, his tail giving a single gentle thump against the floor. He'd been trained to recognize when his young companions were in distress, and every instinct told him that Emma needed his help. But he'd also been trained to wait for her signal, the specific nudge that indicated she was ready to receive his support. In the media section, reporters began typing furiously as it became clear that Emma's silence might derail the entire hearing. Legal experts in the gallery whispered among themselves about what happened if the child couldn't testify. Would Judge Harrison postpone the hearing? Would she make a custody decision without hearing Emma's wishes? Would this become a landmark case about the limitations of children's rights when trauma interfered with their ability to communicate? Rachel Rodriguez's attorney began shuffling through his legal briefs, preparing arguments about why his client should be given another chance, even if Emma couldn't express her preferences. The adoptive family's lawyers did the same, each trying to anticipate how they would argue their case if Emma's testimony became impossible. As the clock approached 10:50 a.m., Judge Harrison prepared to call a recess. The child's distress was becoming too severe to ignore, and continuing to pressure her for testimony seemed cruel and potentially harmful. She opened her mouth to speak the words that would suspend the hearing, possibly for days or weeks. That's when Emma's world began to collapse entirely, and Justice finally sensed it was time to act. The courtroom walls seemed to pulse inward as Emma Rodriguez's breathing became increasingly erratic. Her vision blurred at the edges, the faces of the adults surrounding her melting into an indistinguishable mass of judgment and expectation. The familiar tightness in her chest, the same crushing sensation she'd felt locked in that dark closet 6 months ago, began to squeeze the air from her lungs. Her small hands trembled uncontrollably as the panic attack took hold, threatening to drag her back into the terrifying void of that night when her world had shattered forever. Justice's ears perked forward as he detected the subtle changes in Emma's scent and breathing pattern that his extensive training had taught him to recognize. The golden retriever's heart rate increased slightly, his body tensing with the controlled alertness of a professional responding to an emergency. But his training was absolute. Never intervene without the signal. Wait for the human to ask for help. Trust the process Dr. Peterson had drilled into him through hundreds of hours of preparation. Emma's memories flooded back with devastating clarity. The sound of the closet door slamming shut, her parents' angry voices growing distant, the suffocating darkness that pressed against her like a living thing. Hours of scratching at the door, until her fingernails bled, screaming until her voice gave out entirely. The growing hunger, the overwhelming thirst, the desperate need for a bathroom that never came. And through it all, the terrible understanding that the people who were supposed to love and protect her had chosen to lock her away like a broken toy they no longer wanted. In the gallery, Dr. Peterson leaned forward in her seat, her professional training warring with her personal attachment to Emma's case. She could see the dissociation beginning, the glassy-eyed stare that indicated Emma was retreating into the mental safe space she'd created to survive trauma. The child psychologist's hands clenched into fists as she fought the urge to intervene, knowing that breaking protocol now could undermine months of careful therapeutic work. "Emma," Judge Harrison said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sweetheart, you're safe here? No one is going to hurt you." But her words seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier, unable to reach the little girl who was drowning in memories of abandonment and betrayal. Sarah Henderson felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the child they'd come to love, suffering in such visible anguish. Over the past 3 months, she'd learned to recognize Emma's triggers, to provide the gentle consistency that helped the little girl feel secure. But here, in this formal setting surrounded by strangers, all those careful relationship-building efforts seemed useless against the power of Emma's trauma. Rachel Rodriguez half stood in her seat, maternal instinct overriding legal advice as she watched her daughter's distress. "Baby, it's okay," she whispered desperately, her own voice breaking with emotion. "Mommy's here now. I'm so sorry, Emma. I'm so very sorry." But her words only seemed to increase Emma's agitation, reminding the child of the voice that had once promised safety before delivering betrayal. The courtroom's oppressive silence was broken only by Emma's increasingly rapid breathing and the soft rustling of Justice's fur as he shifted position slightly. The therapy dog's brown eyes remained locked on Emma's face, reading every micro-expression, every subtle change in her posture and breathing. His training told him that intervention was becoming critical. His human was approaching the point of complete psychological collapse. That's when Emma remembered Dr. Peterson's words from their first session together. "When the scary feelings get too big, and you need Justice to help make them smaller, just give him our special signal. He'll know exactly what to do." The memory cut through the fog of panic like a lighthouse beam piercing a storm. Emma's survival instincts, honed by months of trauma and recovery, suddenly kicked in with crystal clarity. With trembling hands that felt disconnected from her body, Emma reached out and gave Justice the gentlest nudge on his right side, barely more than a touch, but unmistakably their practiced signal. The movement was so subtle that most observers missed it entirely, but to Justice, it was as clear as a fire alarm. His months of intensive training activated instantly. A massive golden retriever rose smoothly to his feet, his movements fluid and purposeful despite his 85-pound frame. Without hesitation, Justice positioned himself directly in front of Emma, his body blocking her view of the crowded courtroom and creating an intimate bubble of safety in the midst of chaos. His intelligent brown eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that seemed to say, "I've got you. You're not alone." With the precision of a medical professional, Justice carefully placed his front paws on Emma's shoulders, ensuring his weight was distributed perfectly to provide deep pressure therapy without causing discomfort. His warm, steady presence enveloped her like a living security blanket, his rhythmic breathing serving as a metronome to help regulate her own panicked gasps. The courtroom erupted in barely contained gasps and murmurs as witnesses observed the remarkable transformation beginning to take place. Justice's massive head came to rest gently against Emma's chest, his steady heartbeat vibrating through her small frame like a healing drum. The warmth of his fur against her face carried the familiar scent of safety, a smell that had comforted her through countless nightmares and panic attacks over the past months. Emma's breathing began to slow almost immediately. The crushing weight in her chest started to ease as Justice's calm energy seemed to flow into her trembling body. Her wild, unfocused eyes gradually found their way to his face, where she saw only unconditional love, perfect understanding, and absolute loyalty. Here was the one being in her world who asked nothing of her except to trust him, who never judged her silence or demanded explanations for her fear. The panic that had threatened to consume her began to recede like a tide pulling back from the neck. Sure, Justice's deep pressure therapy worked exactly as Dr. Peterson had promised, the weight and warmth of his body activating Emma's parasympathetic nervous system, triggering the relaxation response that counteracted her fight-or-flight reaction. For the first time in 15 agonizing minutes, Emma Rodriguez smiled. The first word came as barely more than a whisper, so soft that Judge Harrison had to strain to hear it over the courtroom's hushed breathing. "Justice," Emma Rodriguez said, her small voice trembling but unmistakably clear as she looked into her therapy dog's gentle brown eyes. "Justice knows when I'm scared." A collective intake of breath swept through the packed courtroom as 47 people simultaneously realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Court reporter Linda Matthews's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, capturing the first words Emma had spoken in a courtroom after 6 months of silence. In the media section, sketch artists worked frantically to document the moment, while legal observers leaned forward in their seats, understanding that they were witnessing a potential watershed moment in family law. Judge Harrison felt her throat tighten with emotion, but maintained her professional composure as she leaned forward slightly. "Can you tell us more about Justice, Emma?" she asked gently, her voice carrying the warmth of encouragement without a trace of pressure. The judge's 30 years of experience had taught her to recognize breakthrough moments, and every instinct told her to provide space for Emma's voice to emerge naturally. Emma's hand moved slowly to rest on Justice's golden head as the dog continued. His deep pressure therapy, his steady presence serving as an anchor in the overwhelming sea of adult faces surrounding them. "He saved me that night," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "When Mommy and Daddy locked me in a dark closet, I was so scared I couldn't breathe. But I pretended Justice was there with me, keeping me safe." Rachel Rodriguez pressed her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob as she heard her daughter's words. The full weight of what she had done to her own child hit her with devastating force. Marcus Weber placed a steadying hand on his client's shoulder. knowing that any outburst now could derail Emma's testimony and destroy their already minimal chances of reunification. I talked to him all night, Emma continued, her voice growing clearer and more confident as Justice's calming influence worked. It's magic. I told him about being hungry and thirsty, and about how the dark made scary shapes on the walls. I told him about the scratches on my hands from trying to open the door, and how my voice got too tired from calling for help. Tom and Sarah Henderson clutched each other's hands so tightly their knuckles went white. They'd suspected the full horror of Emma's trauma, but hearing her articulate it with such heartbreaking clarity made their protective instincts surge with fierce intensity. Sarah wiped away tears as she listened to the little girl they'd come to love describe the worst night of her young life. Dr. Peterson sat transfixed, watching her months of patient therapeutic work finally bear fruit in the most public possible setting. Emma's ability to verbalize her trauma represented a massive breakthrough in her healing process, the kind of progress that typically took years of careful therapy to achieve. But here, supported by Justice's presence and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her future, Emma was finding strength she didn't know she possessed. Justice helps me sleep now, Emma explained, her small hand stroking the dog's fur with practiced familiarity. When I have bad dreams about the closet, he puts his head right here on my chest, and his heartbeat makes the scary thoughts go away. Mrs. Henderson says his heart beats with love, and love is stronger than being scared. The mention of the Hendersons sent a ripple of attention through their section of the courtroom. Emma had unconsciously identified them as sources of comfort and security, a detail that wouldn't be lost on Judge Harrison when she made her custody decision. The first night Justice came to see me at the children's home, I couldn't stop crying, Emma continued, her narrative flowing more freely now as the therapy dog's presence continued to ground her. I was afraid to trust anybody because the people who were supposed to love me had hurt me so badly. But Justice never asked me to talk. He just sat next to me and let me pet his soft fur until I fell asleep for the first time in weeks. Dr. James and Patricia Washington exchanged glances, recognizing the therapeutic value of Emma's relationship with Justice, even as they hoped she might still choose their family. As medical professionals, they understood trauma recovery better than most, and Emma's articulate description of her healing process impressed them deeply. Justice taught me that not all grown-ups want to hurt kids, Emma said, looking directly at Judge Harrison for the first time. He showed me that Mr. and Mrs. Henderson are safe people who keep their promises. When they said I could stay with them, they meant it. When they said Justice could visit me every day, they did that too. When they said they would never, ever lock me in a dark place, I believed them because Justice trusts them. The Patels listened intently through their interpreter, moved by Emma's resilience despite not fully understanding every word. Raj Patel's mother, drawing on her own experiences with childhood trauma, nodded knowingly as she recognized the universal language of a child learning to trust again. I don't want to go back to the scary house, Emma said clearly, looking directly at her biological parents for the first time since entering the courtroom. I don't want to live with people who put children in closets when they get angry. I want to stay with Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, where Justice and I are both safe, and where nobody yells, and where there's always light when I need it. Rachel Rodriguez buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as she heard her daughter's definitive rejection. But even through her grief, she felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that Emma had found people who could give her the safety and love she deserved. Judge Harrison sat in stunned silence, realizing that in 20 minutes of testimony, 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez had delivered one of the most powerful and articulate statements about trauma, healing, and the meaning of family that she'd ever heard in her courtroom. The silent child had finally found her voice, and her words would change everything. Judge Margaret Harrison sat in stunned silence as Emma's voice continued to fill the courtroom with remarkable clarity and emotional depth. In 3 decades presiding over family court, she had never witnessed such a profound transformation, nor heard testimony delivered with such raw honesty and surprising wisdom from someone so young. Emma's words weren't just answering legal questions about custody preferences. They were providing a masterclass in trauma recovery, resilience, and the healing power of unconditional love. Justice never gets angry at me when I can't talk, Emma continued, her small hand never leaving the golden retriever's head as he maintained his therapeutic position. Sometimes I have days where the scared feelings are too big for words, and I can only draw pictures or write notes. But Justice understands my quiet days. He sits with me and lets me know that being quiet is okay, that I'm still important even when I can't find my voice. The judge felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes as she watched this remarkable child articulate concepts that seasoned psychologists struggled to explain to their adult patients. Emma's understanding of her own trauma responses and healing process demonstrated a level of self-awareness that spoke volumes about the quality of therapeutic support she'd received and the inherent strength of her character. Dr. Rebecca Peterson sat transfixed in the professional observer section, watching months of careful therapeutic work culminate in this extraordinary public testimony. Emma was demonstrating textbook examples of trauma processing, emotional regulation, and trust rebuilding, all facilitated by her relationship with Justice. The child psychologist made rapid notes, knowing that this case would become a landmark study in animal-assisted therapy for traumatized children. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson taught me that families don't hurt each other, Emma said, looking directly at Tom and Sarah Henderson with obvious affection. They showed me that when grown-ups make promises to children, they keep them. When they said I could decorate my room any color I wanted, they took me to the paint store and let me pick purple walls with yellow stars on the ceiling. When they said Justice could have his own bed in my room, they bought the biggest, softest dog bed at the pet store. Sarah Henderson pressed her hand to her heart, remembering that magical Saturday afternoon when Emma had chosen paint colors with the concentrated seriousness of someone who had never been allowed to make decisions about her own space before. Tom squeezed his wife's hand, both of them overwhelmed by the public validation that their approach to helping Emma heal had been successful. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, her legal training recognizing the significance of Emma's detailed testimony about stability, consistency, and emotional security. Emma, can you tell me more about how Justice has helped you feel safe in your new home? She asked gently, knowing that this information would be crucial in her custody decision. The first week I lived with the Hendersons, I was too scared to sleep in a bed, Emma explained with matter-of-fact honesty that made several observers gasp quietly. I slept on the floor in the corner of the room because corners feel safer when you've been locked in small spaces. But Justice came to visit every day, and he would lie down next to me on the floor. After a while, I felt brave enough to put my pillow next to his bed. Then one night, when I had a really bad nightmare about the closet, Justice jumped up on the real bed and showed me it was safe. The courtroom listened in absolute silence as Emma continued her narrative, each detail painting a vivid picture of trauma recovery, guided by an extraordinary therapy dog. Legal observers scribbled frantically, understanding that they were witnessing testimony that would be studied and cited in family law cases for years to come. Justice taught me the difference between good surprises and scary surprises, Emma said, her voice growing stronger with confidence. Good surprises are like when Mrs. Henderson makes my favorite pancakes on Sunday mornings, or when Mr. Henderson brings home books from the school library for me to read. Scary surprises are like when doors slam unexpectedly, or when people raise their voices. Justice can tell the difference, and he helps me know which kind of surprise is happening. Rachel Rodriguez listened to her daughter's words with a mixture of heartbreak and strange pride. Even through her own grief at losing custody, she could hear the remarkable healing and growth that Emma had experienced. The articulate, confident child testifying before the court bore little resemblance to the silent, traumatized girl who had been removed from their home 6 months earlier. Judge Harrison glanced at the clock and realized that Emma had been speaking continuously for nearly 25 minutes, longer than many adult witnesses managed to sustain coherent testimony. More importantly, the child showed no signs of the anxiety or dissociation that had characterized her earlier court appearances. Justice's presence had created a bubble of safety that allowed Emma's true personality to emerge. "Your Honor," Emma said suddenly, using formal address that surprised everyone in the courtroom, "I want to say something important about my first mommy and daddy." Rachel Rodriguez looked up hopefully, wondering if her daughter might express forgiveness or a desire for contact. "I know they made really big mistakes that hurt me very badly," Emma continued with startling emotional maturity. "Dr. Peterson explained to me that sometimes grown-ups have problems in their hearts that make them do mean things to children. I hope my first mommy and daddy can fix their heart problems so they never hurt another little kid like they hurt me. But I can't go back to live with people who might lock me in dark places again, because Justice and I both know that wouldn't be safe." The courtroom erupted in barely contained emotion as Emma delivered what amounted to a victim impact statement, combined with a custody preference declaration, all wrapped in the compassionate words of a child who had somehow managed to maintain her capacity for empathy despite suffering severe abuse. Judge Harrison knew that she was witnessing something unprecedented in her courtroom, a transformation that would change not only Emma's life, but potentially revolutionize how the justice system approached cases involving traumatized children. The silent child had become a voice for thousands of others. Judge Margaret Harrison rose from her bench as Emma concluded her extraordinary testimony, the weight of 3 decades of judicial experience informing every word she was about to speak. The packed courtroom held its collective breath, understanding that this decision would resonate far beyond the life of one 8-year-old girl and her golden retriever companion. Legal history was about to be made, and everyone present knew they were witnessing a watershed moment in family law. "In my 30 years presiding over Denver Family Court," Judge Harrison began, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom with the authority of someone who had seen every conceivable family tragedy and triumph, "I have never witnessed testimony as profound, articulate, and emotionally intelligent as what we have heard today from Emma Rodriguez. This child has not only found her voice, she has become a voice for thousands of children who suffer in silence within our overburdened system." Emma sat quietly beside Justice, her small hand resting on his golden head as the therapy dog maintained his position of support. The little girl who had entered this courtroom frozen with terror now radiated a calm confidence that seemed to emanate from her deepening bond with the remarkable animal who had saved her. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Harrison continued, including Emma's clear and unequivocal testimony about her preferences, "I hereby award permanent custody of Emma Rodriguez to Thomas and Sarah Henderson." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers, sobs, and applause as Emma launched herself into Sarah Henderson's arms, Justice bounding beside her with his tail wagging furiously for the first time all day. But Judge Harrison raised her hand for silence, signaling that her historic ruling was far from complete. "Furthermore, I am establishing what will be known as the Justice Protocol, a comprehensive program requiring therapy dogs to be made available for all traumatized children involved in custody proceedings within this judicial district." What we have witnessed today proves that healing and justice are not mutually exclusive concepts. Dr. Rebecca Peterson felt tears of professional vindication, streaming down her face as she realized that years of research and advocacy had culminated in this groundbreaking judicial recognition. The Justice Protocol would revolutionize how courts across America treated child trauma victims, providing them with the emotional support necessary to participate meaningfully in proceedings that determined their futures. The court recognizes that traditional adversarial proceedings often re-traumatize children who have already suffered unimaginable abuse, Judge Harrison explained to the captivated audience. Today, Emma Rodriguez and her therapy dog Justice have shown us a better way, a path toward healing that honors both the child's voice and their fundamental need for emotional safety. Rachel Rodriguez sat in stunned silence, processing the finality of losing her daughter, while simultaneously feeling profound relief that Emma had found people who could provide the love and stability she deserved. Through her grief, she experienced unexpected gratitude toward the Hendersons for giving Emma something she had been unable to provide: unconditional safety and the chance to heal. The media section buzzed with excitement as reporters realized they were covering a story that would dominate news cycles for weeks. The silent child case had evolved into something far more significant, a landmark legal precedent that would protect vulnerable children nationwide. Phones vibrated constantly with calls from news producers, legal scholars, and child advocacy organizations eager to understand the implications of Judge Harrison's revolutionary ruling. This court also directs the Colorado Department of Human Services to establish a statewide animal-assisted therapy program for children in foster care. Judge Harrison announced, her voice growing stronger with each word. Emma's recovery demonstrates that healing trauma requires more than just removing children from dangerous situations. We must actively provide them with tools and relationships that help them rebuild trust and find their voices. Tom and Sarah Henderson clutched Emma tightly as they processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. Not only had they officially become parents to the remarkable little girl who had already claimed their hearts, but they had also become part of a legal revolution that would help countless other children. Emma looked up at them with shining eyes, whispering, "Can justice come home with us forever now?" 6 months later, Emma Rodriguez Henderson stood before a joint session of Congress, her hand resting on Justice's head as she testified in support of the Voices for Children Act, federal legislation inspired by her case. The bill mandated animal-assisted therapy programs in family courts nationwide and provided funding for specialized training of both therapy animals and court personnel. "My name is Emma, and this is my dog Justice," she began, her clear voice carrying through the hallowed halls where laws were made. 6 months ago, I couldn't speak because scary things had happened to me. But Justice helped me remember that my voice matters, and that speaking my truth can help other kids who are scared like I was. The legislation passed unanimously, with senators from both parties citing Emma's testimony as the most compelling argument for systemic reform they had ever heard. Within 2 years, therapy dog programs existed in family courts across all 50 states, with thousands of traumatized children finding their voices through relationships with specially trained animals. Dr. Amanda Foster's Colorado Canine Therapy Foundation became the model for similar organizations nationwide, training hundreds of therapy dog teams specifically for courtroom environments. Justice himself became something of a celebrity, appearing on magazine covers and inspiring children's books about courage, healing, and the power of the human-animal bond. Emma's story sparked a revolution in child welfare that extended far beyond courtrooms. Schools implemented therapy dog programs for students with trauma histories. Hospitals began using animal-assisted therapy for pediatric patients. Child Protective Services agencies partnered with animal welfare organizations to provide therapeutic support for children in crisis. Most importantly, Emma Rodriguez Henderson grew up knowing that her voice had changed the world. The silent child who once cowered in darkness had become a beacon of hope for vulnerable children everywhere, proving that healing was possible, that trauma could be overcome, and that sometimes the most profound justice came with 4 legs and a wagging tail. Justice had indeed been served, for Emma, for countless children who would benefit from her courage, and for a legal system that finally learned to listen with both law and love.